Hello, it's Andrew here. Just a note about this special episode. It contains conversations about the history of mental health as well as suicide, and we'll be using some of the archaic terminology that we find as genealogists in the archives. Therefore, if you'd rather sit this episode out, then I hope you'll join us in a few weeks for Season 9. In the meantime, here's the episode. Hello, and welcome to the Family Histories Podcast, the show for and about those of us who are sat quietly in libraries, archives and spare rooms all around the world, tirelessly piecing together our collective social and family history. My name is Andrew Martin, I'm a family historian, and I'll be your host. In this special podcast-thon episode, The Invisible, we'll hear about a woman who had to choose between the workhouse or prison and then spent the rest of her life in mental health institutions. And we'll be looking for a 19th century couple from Lancashire, England, with Yorkshire connections. So, put down that old admissions book, grab a cuppa, and let's meet our guest. My guest today is a family historian whose passion for genealogy started at a young age, but after a brief time away, she returned tenfold and has been blogging, studying and giving talks about her discoveries along the way. She is also a familiar friend of this podcast, and for those of you who've listened to Series 1, you'll recognise her, because it's Jane Hough. Hello, Jane. Welcome back to the Family Histories Podcast.
Hello, Andrew. It's lovely to be back. I feel very privileged to be invited again.
Well, congratulations on being the first one to make it back to the show. It's lovely to have you here. Now, when we last spoke back in 2021, and if listeners want to hear that episode, they can just scroll back to one called The Laundress from Series 1. I believe that you might have continued researching your family history.
Of course I have, Andrew. How could I not? I'm a complete addict and I think family history, once you've bitten the bug, it's something you probably carry on for the rest of your life. For me, I guess it's like it's a detective story where there's always another chapter. As soon as you find out one thing, there's something else to find out. So it just keeps going.
Oh, so you haven't finished it yet then?
No, I haven't. There's plenty more to do, I can assure you. I just need a bit more time, but I have to wait for retirement, I think.
So over the years that you've been researching, do you have a sense of maybe how your research methods have changed? I mean, we talked, as I said, in 2021. So, have they changed much since then?
For me, family history is a hobby. It's not a professional job. It's not something I earn money from. So I've always started from the perspective that I can do what I want and I can do it how I want because it's just for me and it's just for fun. Yeah. But as I've got more involved in it, I have started to realise that being methodical does have its benefits. So in the last couple of years, I've started using research logs where I actually document for a family group. I document what I've found, what I've searched, and also what I haven't found. And I try to list out searches that were unsuccessful, so at least I know. And while it might seem a bit tedious to do this sort of administration behind the scenes, it does pay for itself very quickly because if you're only researching once every few days or every few weeks, it shows you very quickly where you left off rather than, as so often happened, I would go back to something and I'd do some searches and then think, oh, actually, I've looked at this before. So it does really help you keep track of what you've done and where you left things. Okay. And also, of course, if you log unsuccessful searches, it may be that new records become available. So something I've looked at very recently is the Lloyd George Valuation Survey from 1910. And Dorset has just been released on The Genealogist. And that's given me a whole new lot of information to search for. But a year ago, that wasn't there. And they're really building out the number of counties where that information is now published. So it's useful to know what you've done. And it may be that you go back to something that you last looked at several years ago, but at least you know where you were, what you found and what you didn't.
What are you using to do this log? Because I love this idea of giving yourself some clues for your future self.
Well, you might know this, Andrew, but I work in finance, so I love a spreadsheet.
Oh.
They're not very sophisticated, but I have a table for a family group. It lists the names of the people, their years of birth or baptism, marriage, death, and I have columns for each census. I put a tick in when I found the information from that census, just tracking all the key sort of records that you might expect to find for someone, from birth registration, baptism, censuses, marriage, through to death and burial and probate. And I just tick where I've found something, I leave it blank where I haven't found something, and then there are various notes below to show what I've done and where I've been unsuccessful in information. Or possibly, it might be this one, but I'm not sure because there's two people that this could possibly fit. So it's just a series of Excel files. It's nothing very sophisticated, and I keep one file for each family group.
I think if you hadn't have said that you worked in finance, people might have guessed it from the efforts that you go to detail everything and to check it off. So yeah, I will have a think about how I could maybe adopt some of that as well. I also believe that you have been doing some studying as well.
That's right. So everything I've done up until last year has been entirely self-taught. I've read books, I've watched YouTube videos, I've been to conferences and heard talks. I listen to quite a lot of talks from family history societies that I'm a member of. I think it's one of the great benefits of the pandemic that so many family history societies initially had to go to using Zoom for their meetings, but a lot of them have kept either Zoom or at least some hybrid meetings. And there are so many talks I'm able to go to now. I attended one yesterday with Gloucestershire Family History Society, and it was a talk from a professional genealogist who has worked on the programme Who Do You Think You Are? And that was fascinating to really get behind the scenes.
Okay.
So until now I've been self-taught, but I guess I've wanted to extend my skills and thinking, I guess, possibly to having a career as a genealogist where I might earn a bit of money from it, possibly in a semi-retirement or retirement role.
Okay.
And I've started to study with Pharos tutors, and their intermediate certificate is what I'm looking at the moment.
Yep.
And it's accredited by the Society of Genealogists. And there are 10 modules you have to do within 3 years. And I've just completed my 5th module. So I've been going for a year and I've managed to get 5 done in a year. 4 of them I can tell you I've passed. 1 I'm waiting for results on.
My fingers are crossed.
Yes, indeed. But it's been really fascinating to actually get really under the skin of a topic and also to have the discipline of studying. I haven't studied anything since I was at university, really, which is a rather long time ago now. But the discipline of study has been really interesting. And it's not so much, for me at least, it's not so much the intellectual challenge. It's much more about time management. I have a family, I work full time, so therefore fitting in study and deadlines takes a bit of self-discipline.
Sure.
I've really enjoyed the study, and it's so much of it is focused on really good practical skills, such as understanding where to look for wills and all the different pieces of information that you can find which are associated with wills and probate. And the course I've just finished is one on apprenticeships, which, again, there's so much documentation associated with apprenticeships. And it's been fascinating to really learn not just what it exists and why, but where you can go and find it and what you might learn and what that signposts you to. So it's very much grounded in practical skills, which I think is important.
When you've been doing this studying, have you thought, oh my goodness, why did I do that in my own research? Have you sort of thought, I did something wrong, or has it changed how you're researching?
I don't think it's shown up any sort of obvious mistakes and errors, but what it has done is really open my eyes to the things I've just never been aware of until now. So I think wills and also apprenticeships are things which Now, I just need a bit of time now to sort of think, okay, so there's all this information out there which I never knew anything about.
Yeah.
And there are so many more opportunities to go and research things that I had never really seen. And also, I think it's important to bear in mind that not everything is available online. And so much of this fantastic information is in county archives and record offices.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I've been sort of crawling through the online catalogues of some of the counties where I have lots of ancestors and thinking about how I might sort of organise a visit to different parts of the country. And in fact, I have a visit to Dorset booked for late March, where I'm going to be looking at various things there.
Nice. So do you have a favourite record type? And if so, why?
Goodness. I think probably now it might be wills, actually, because there's just so much information. I guess it's also something where you can be a little bit nosy about someone's lifestyle. If it's a more detailed will, it tells you so much about the things people owned, who they wanted them to go to, what land and property they owned, and lots of perhaps little incidental things that get mentioned as well. So I've inherited a few wills from more recent ancestors, and there are bequests of things like, so my great aunt left her piano to one of her children and her music to someone, her sheet music. It's little things like that that give you so much more insight into someone's life than you get just from a census record or from a birth or marriage certificate. You get a little bit under the skin of who someone is.
Yeah, I read a will recently whilst cataloguing for the Littleport Society, and they had left their donkey, Nellie, to their daughter. So they'd actually named this donkey. I was thinking, well, where else in public records would you find that?
It's brilliant. And I have a more distant Dorset ancestor, and the first line in his will was that he bequested all of his wine cellar to his wife. And I thought, what a good man he was.
Wow, that must have been quite something to open the will with that. So
Yes, indeed. And of course, wills are now much easier to access now that there is the probate search available, which has only come in the last couple of years. And it's very cheap to buy them. They're £1.50 each, and it's quite easy just to order a few and see what you get.
yeah, I mean, they kind of accidentally just fall into your shopping cart, and then before you know it, you've paid for them.
That's right, yes. And I had one where a couple had separated, and the husband left his ex-wife the house for the duration of her life, but didn't leave her anything else. And he said, and this is covered in a letter which is saved separately. So there's clearly some mystery there that was where events that had taken place were documented in a letter, presumably lodged with a firm of solicitors, but unfortunately that's not with the will. So I think my chances of ever finding that are pretty much zero. But again, it points to things that might have happened within the family that you wouldn't find otherwise.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of things that you wouldn't find otherwise, I believe that you have joined something called Few Forgotten Women Research Team.
That's right, yes. I'm not quite sure what to call it. It's a group of people who research women's life stories.
Okay.
And the way in which I have become involved is about 3 times a year they have a sort of in real time research day where everyone who wants to volunteer, they're given records often from an institution. So they might be the actual administrative records of that institution, or they might be, for example, the census records, which list everyone who is in that institution on a particular census.
Right.
And each researcher is allocated one woman. You can receive an email first thing in the morning, and the aim is that each person does as much as they can to find out about that particular person. Sometimes it can be very, very brief. There just really isn't much to find. Quite often the stories are sad ones, Some of the institutions we've looked at have included a reformatory for inebriate women, and this was round about the turn of the 20th century, where drunkenness in the streets, particularly in London, was a big problem. And some of the women were not sent to prison, but were sent to a reformatory in the hope that 2 or 3 years there would sort them out and put them back on the straight and narrow. And I think it's really interesting because so often women go under the radar in records relative to men. So it's been really interesting to learn something of the lives of different women. And there's a website for the group, and all the stories get published. Each person writes their story up within a few weeks of the research day, and they're all collected on the website where you can read all of these stories. They're grouped both by research day but also by the theme. So sometimes the theme might be drunkenness, it might be particular illnesses or disabilities. So I was involved in one which included records for people sent to a school for the deaf.
Right, yeah.
That was interesting. And also we did one for a women's teacher training college in Cheshire, so an early teacher training college in the early part of the 20th century. So there's lots of very different stories. And I also like being part of a group of people that are all doing the same thing on the same day. So we have there's an open Zoom meeting, and you can drop in and out just to chat and share what you found, or ask the group, the lead group, for suggestions of where to go. And I like the camaraderie of it as much as the research.
It sounds a little bit like what you'd find in other places, like a hackathon, where everyone focuses on one kind of set of data or one particular problem or issue with, in technology, for example, and then you would all work towards kind of solving that or understanding it better. So it's kind of like a genie hackathon in a way.
It is, yes. And we discover some amazing stories, and sometimes there was one and I just discovered, I spent hours looking at it and I could not find anything other than the census record I was given. It was a common name, and their birth in the census was just recorded as London, and there was just really nothing that I could find. I don't know for a census before or after. And someone called Mary Brown or whatever the name was from London, you're really not going to get very far without other information. And I just had to admit defeat on that one. But that's rare, thankfully.
Yeah. And in those instances, do you then kind of get another person to research? Because otherwise that could be a very short day for you.
There is that option, although these days I think so many people have signed up that I think typically there are something like 70, 80 or even 90 people taking part, and they can be in different countries across the world as well. So again, that makes it a very sort of inclusive activity to be a part of, where you've got researchers in different countries contributing as well. So that adds to the enjoyment of it.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And can you recall what their website address is for anyone who's interested in taking part?
I think it's just called viewforgottenwomen.com, which is all one word, all lowercase.
We'll put a link to it in the description and the show notes for this episode, so listeners can go and find out some more and maybe join you and the others on a Zoom call on one of your next events. Aside from this, what do you think that the genealogy community or maybe the industry could do to make it a better place?
I guess one of my sort of bugbears is this idea that everything is online, and that with hints on some of the big subscription sites, you can build a tree. And I think almost it's made to look so easy. And yes, you can go down that route and you can build a tree very quickly from hints. But I think it's about ensuring people have sufficient knowledge to be able to discern the information they're looking at, and have enough knowledge of the sources, enough knowledge of the time period and the locality that you're researching to actually be able to critically weigh up what you're looking at and whether it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I guess I wouldn't say I'm anti-artificial intelligence, but I have to say I'm something of a skeptic. And I do worry that advances in artificial intelligence may make that even more of an issue than it is at the moment. But that's not to say I don't see the potential in the way that artificial intelligence might be able to transcribe information automatically, whether doing free text searches of scanned images might one day become more automated. So it's not that I'm against it. I think it's that critical thinking. I'm concerned that that might disappear and that people just accept things that are fed to them through algorithms and through hints and so forth. It does also show the importance of looking at the original record wherever possible rather than relying on a transcription, because we all know that the more a document is copied or transcribed, the more potential there is for errors to crop in, and names get reversed. You can be John Michael in one and Michael John in another, and spellings can quite easily get sort of changed inadvertently. So wherever possible, go to the actual original document rather than the transcription.
As we carefully climb back through our family trees, we often find some fascinating stories of our relatives making their way through life's good times and bad. With this in mind, it's therefore time for my guest to choose one of their relatives and share their life story. And to help us navigate this part of the episode, we're joined by professional genealogist, tutor and co-author of the book Lunatics, Imbeciles and Idiots, A History of Insanity in 19th Century Britain and Ireland. It's Kathryn Burtinshaw. Hello, Kathryn. Welcome to the Family Histories podcast.
Hi there. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. So, Jane, who are you going to introduce us to?
On this occasion, Andrew, I'm going to tell you about my great-grandmother, Lilian Maude Evans, as she was born, and she became Lilian Maude Bowdler.
Okay.
So it's a closer ancestor than the one I featured with you before.
And so where does Lilian's story begin?
It starts, I guess, when she married my great-grandfather in 1908. In Gloucestershire, in the Forest of Dean. They very quickly had a child, somewhat less than 9 months later, which was my granddad. And then that was followed by 8 other children, including a set of twins.
Okay.
So by 1922, there were 9 children in the family.
Gosh, that's quite a brood.
It is, yes. And at some of the time, my great-grandfather was away fighting in the Great War. So she would have been a very busy lady looking after those children. I guess where the story really begins is when I first had access to the British newspaper archive, I think initially on a trial, and I just wanted to sort of max out all the names I could think of to search for in the newspaper archives. It was a new resource for me back then. So I searched on the surname Bowdler and very quickly came up with a newspaper article about a court case which involved my great-grandmother. And she was found wandering the streets abroad, which I think is a term which relates to the Vagrancy Act many years before.
Okay.
But she was in a state of distress. She was wandering the streets at night and she was arrested.
Oh.
And after that, she was put up in court and she was offered to go to the workhouse or to be sent to prison. So she very reluctantly chose the workhouse. And that's really as far as I got for some time until I was able to visit Gloucestershire archives and I was able to look at the minutes of the Board of Guardians and I found out a bit more about the story. What I couldn't find anywhere was Maude's death certificate. What I had known from the family was that she probably died in the 1920s, but I could not find any death certificate. And then someone pointed out a death certificate in Devon from the 1950s, which didn't make any sense at all. And then the 1939 register was really the key to unlock it because I found Maude in a mental hospital near Exeter. And it's through that really I have filled in the gaps.
You said that she had been arrested in 1922. Was this simply because she was wandering the streets or had she done something else?
I think it was simply through wandering the streets. There's no other
reports of anything else of creating, a disturbance, causing damage or any other crimes. My sense is that she was probably already in a mentally unstable condition, and with having had her latest child only a few months before, she may well have been suffering from postnatal depression. So that's, without any detailed evidence, that's my working assumption. But, she was going through a hard time, certainly.
Kathryn, if I can turn to you, is a workhouse or prison a common place for people to go if they're arrested for this kind of thing?
Yes, it's not uncommon. It isn't uncommon.
Okay.
What should have happened, I think, really was that they should have identified who her next of kin was. So they should have contacted her husband to find out where he was so that he could make an account for her, so she would have a representative with her. But vagrancy was something that was against the law, and they didn't really look to see what was causing the vagrancy. Unless, as Jane said, she was causing a disturbance, was drunk in the street, or what have you, which she clearly wasn't. So at that point, they probably took her to the workhouse first, and before she went to court. I'm sure the workhouse would have been far less stigmatising, actually, than being sent to prison, and potential prison sentence that would have occurred as a result of a stay in the prison. I mean, the workhouse was not a pleasant place to be, so she really didn't have a great deal of choice between the two. Neither of them were an attractive option, but I think she probably chose the less difficult option, the less stigmatising option for her at that point.
Yeah.
There would also have been an infirmary within the workhouse, so it's possible that she felt she needed care. If she just had a child, she may have herself realised that she was in need of some medical assistance and that she would receive it at the workhouse.
Jane, what becomes of the family group now that the mother is in the workhouse and the father is sometimes away from home?
For a while, the children were all in the workhouse as well, which I found quite distressing. So my great-grandfather, he had to go out and work. He couldn't look after the children as well. It sounds harsh, but I guess it was a way of keeping the children together in some form. And he, in fact, later moved away and moved to Wales and started a new family with another partner, leaving the children there. But gradually arrangements were made for the children. I don't think there was any falling out over it, because my granddad moved to Wales to be with his father, and the other children, there's no sense of the family disowning him.
Okay.
So they all just seem to get along.
And with her husband going off to start this new relationship, did she somehow have access to divorce?
No, I think at that time he was living as man and wife, and there are newspaper reports which talk about Mr. and Mrs. Bowdler, and she was registered to vote as Mrs. Bowdler, but she wasn't Mrs. Bowdler. And I guess while I want to feature Maude and not my great-grandfather, that second partner sadly died, and then he took up a third relationship and had yet more children. And divorce did in fact come much later, but at the time that Maude was in the mental hospital in Devon.
So she goes from workhouse to mental hospital. How long was she in the workhouse for?
From the records I've looked at, it's until about 1929, and I think that coincides with the time when workhouses sort of formally closed. So at that point she was transferred to a mental hospital in Gloucester, and she stayed there for about 9 years.
Wow.
I don't have any records of that time, but the records I do have all come from Devon, and they start at the point where she was transferred from Gloucestershire to Devon. And I think this is a sort of very late reflection of the old rules about parish settlement, because with my great-grandfather having by this point moved to Devon, she had no connections to Gloucestershire, and therefore it seems to be this is the only reason why she moved, because my great-grandfather had moved, and therefore it should be Devon that's taking on the responsibility for care.
From the research that you've done, Jane, what sort of terminology and language are we seeing to describe Lilian? Obviously, this is the old terminology, which I'm sure you're going to give us here, but what sort of terms are you seeing?
When I first got the records, I didn't actually read them. I wasn't sure what I was going to find. But I did look at them, and eventually, of course, and the terminology is very much of its time. It describes her as a dementing schizophrenic. The word lunatic is used quite a lot in her records, which, from my upbringing, was always a term of abuse. I don't think of it as a medical term. It's an insult to call someone a lunatic. It's not a medical term in my upbringing. There are also descriptions of her hallucinations as well, which again are difficult. She thought she was the Queen of China. That's one of the things that's described. And yes, I think the one thing I do take from them is that the staff seem to be quite sympathetic to her condition. What I don't know, and there's no mention of at all in the records, is of any medication or treatment that was provided. So I don't know whether she did have any treatment or whether she was just there because it was a safe place where she could be supervised. We're talking about the 1940s and 50s here, so I don't really know what was common at the time.
And Kathryn, how can we unpack these terms like lunatic? What would that kind of encompass by our modern understanding?
The terms lunatic, imbecile and idiot were very specific legal terminologies to begin with. Idiots were known as natural fools from as early as the 13th century, and there were laws in place to protect them from their lands being taken, basically, by the king. And the term imbecile was then defined later to differentiate an idiot from an imbecile.
Okay.
An idiot, they would have had potentially a congenital, maybe they were born with a congenital defect which prevented them from ever achieving or learning or being able to care for themselves. An imbecile perhaps had acquired a learning disability as a result of an accident, for example, which would have caused a delay in development. So those two terms are very much legal terms. They're terms that were used right through the centuries and actually are still on the census documents. If you look at census documents, they're still being referred to as in that disability column as imbecile, idiot and lunatic, along with deaf and dumb and blind.
Yeah, I've certainly seen that whilst researching.
The term lunatic is different in that someone who is described as a lunatic has acquired a form of mental aberration, if you like. Generally, normally it would have been melancholia or mania were the early definitions. They weren't sure why people developed any form of lunacy. There was normally a predisposing cause, and they attempted to find a predisposing cause. And I noticed that in Maude's records that she does have a predisposing cause, and it's to do with drink. That it states quite clearly that there's a possibility that her parents were heavy drinkers.
Yeah. And
in her divorce papers, it's her husband. Okay, this is his opinion. We don't have her side of it because she wasn't asked. Was that she was a heavy drinker and was violent towards the children. But that may well not have been the case because, as I say, we don't know from her point of view. But those divorce records are quite crucial because divorcing somebody who was in mental asylum was illegal up to 1937. So your great-grandfather had no option. He couldn't divorce her until there was a new Act of Parliament in 1937, which allowed him then to divorce Maude on grounds of her insanity, because obviously the marriage wasn't sustainable if she'd been in an asylum for too long. Mm. And she would have been given a representative, somebody who would have explained it to her. Now, I noticed in the records that she claims that she wasn't married. She refers to herself by her maiden name, and she makes a very unusual comment. She knows she's got children. She knows exactly how many children she has. She has 9. She says that she has 9, so she's aware of that. But she considers herself to be sinful, and she says she hasn't been churched. Now, the term churching, it takes place when a woman has had a baby, and before they go out with the child, they go to church to give thanks for the birth of that child. Now, it's possible because she had a child who was born, let's just say, less than 9 months after her marriage, that she didn't feel able to go to church, to be churched herself, although I suspect she probably had the children baptised I'm not sure, Jane, you may well have found baptism records for them. But it was clearly something that was on her mind.
Yes, so the marriage took place in a register office, not the church, and the children were all baptised in different places and in a rather sort of ad hoc manner. So some were baptised a few months after birth, and then they moved house several times. But then there's a group who were all baptised together, I think, when the last child was born. So there's obviously some catching up to do in terms of baptisms.
Yeah, that's not uncommon, actually. You quite often see a whole family being taken together, particularly if they lived in a remote area where they may not have had access to be able to go to church every Sunday. They take them all on a specific day. It's a kind of like a job lot, if you like, and have them all baptised at the same time. So that's not unusual. In fact, I've seen that in my own family, and they're all different ages. And it tends to be when the youngest child has been born and they realise, hang on a minute, we haven't had the others baptised, let's go and get them all done together. So that's not unusual. But I think looking at Maude's asylum records, which are very, very similar to the records that were being recorded in the 19th century, where they were asking, is she dangerous? Is she epileptic? Is she suicidal? This kind of thing. And she has shown tendencies to suicide. She must have been very desperate. And suicide, epilepsy and danger to others were the three key factors that would have made somebody be transferred from a workhouse into an asylum. They couldn't have coped with that kind of behaviour within a workhouse or a prison. So any forms of epilepsy, suicide or danger to others, there would have been a referral from two doctors who probably didn't know her, may only have seen her once, and they would have made an application to the Commissioners of Lunacy to have her transferred into a local lunatic asylum. Now, initially, that may only have been a temporary measure, because asylums were places of refuge where they were very much created from the 1845 onwards to be places of refuge where people were encouraged to rest, have relaxation, and just forget about the things that were going on in their minds that were worrying them, and be able to take part in the activities of the asylum. And they were encouraged to participate in activities because asylums were built as almost like mini estates, if you like. So they were self-supporting, they had their own farm, there would be a dairy, there would be sewing rooms for the women, laundries, and the women were encouraged to work in those environments and the men on the farms. So, they weren't encouraged to be idle. And I noticed that the staff are very much trying to persuade her to take part in activities, but she seems very, very reluctant. One reason being that she believes that she's too grand as the Queen of China to be doing any form of work. And another, I've noticed that she has a tendency to hypochondria. It states quite clearly in the records as well. So maybe she felt just too unwell to participate in any work. I very much get the impression that they're treated kindly. They're not, asylums were very much places where they were there for the benefit of the patient. They were there for their mental well-being. Not all the staff would have treated them well, but without a shadow of a doubt. And obviously the other patients would have had an impact on each other. But there would have been medical care available. And the fact that there isn't any treatment stated for your great-grandmother until she becomes medically unwell indicates to me that actually they didn't feel that they could do anything for her mental condition. It was only when she became medically unwell, when she began to lose weight, that they actually intervened and started taking her to a hospital. And that's not unusual. We're talking primitive medicine. There was very little understood about the causes of many of these conditions, as there is today. It's still today, many conditions are misunderstood, and they didn't have the medication to help her control any forms of hallucination. It also appears that basically her family may have not abandoned her because her daughter clearly wanted to find out about her later on in life when she discovered that she was ill. But the fact that you were told as a child that, she died in the 1920s suggests that this is an episode that the family wished to brush under the carpet. That's completely normal. Most families would have done exactly the same thing. It's not a topic of general conversation.
I think that whilst medicine and science have advanced their understanding of mental health, language and conversation has been perhaps a little bit slower, and people are only just now starting to talk about mental health, and people are just starting to talk about their own mental health. Jane, how long was Maude within a mental health institution?
In total, it would have been 30 years. So she went to the workhouse in 1922 and she died in the asylum in 1952. So it's a full 30 years. I guess while it's an incredibly sad story, I do feel some sort of sense of peace, I guess, that I've added 30 years to her life.
Yeah.
Because everyone thought she died around in the early 1920s. So while it's not a happy story, I'm glad I've uncovered it, and I know. It was very difficult to tell my mother because obviously all of this was complete news to her. And I think she struggled initially because obviously it was information that she had not been told by her parents at any point in her life. So I think she had two things to process. One was the story of Maude, but also why she wasn't told about what had happened when, as some of those letters between family members and the hospital show, the family did know where she was and were in contact with the hospital, albeit only very occasionally. Firstly, to inquire about divorce, and then secondly, towards the end, when they knew she was medically ill. And in fact, she was diagnosed with cancer. So that's where her story ended.
Yeah. And obviously, if this had occurred, I don't know how many years later, then maybe her treatment would have been different.
I'd like to think so.
I'm sure today, in today's terms, yes, there's a far greater understanding. Medication is advanced. And I think possibly it's quite likely that she would have been able to have been helped with medical assistance. It's difficult to say because the case notes provide so many different types of information and different types of symptoms that she's got. And I think they're probably just guessing that she has schizophrenia because she has hallucinations. But there are other symptoms going on in the background there that may have been caused by other things. It's difficult to tell. It's very, very difficult to tell. And of course, you only get someone's observation of Maude. What I haven't been able to pull out of these records, and it's not unusual, is Maude's voice. Her voice is missing, and I like to be able to hear the patient voice, but what we're getting is someone else's opinion on her behaviour, someone else's opinion about the way she's behaving, acting. Nobody's actually recorded what she said about herself, apart from the fact that she says she's the Queen of China. But nobody's sort of then said, well, why do you think you're the Queen of China? We don't receive a reply to any question they may have posed to her about why she thinks the way she does. And that's, I think, in this day and age, we'd be looking at a two-way conversation, a question posed from a medical professional and the answer from the patient, where these records very much, and this is completely normal, they record what the medical superintendents, the doctors, the attendants are seeing, as opposed to what the patient is trying to tell them. And it's sad. It is sad.
Yeah.
Occasionally you hear the patient voice, but not very often.
That's a very interesting reflection, actually, Kathryn. And it's even more profound because she's the only great-grandparent for whom I don't have any photographs. So I have no voice, I have no image of her either, just the story.
That's very unusual because they did take pictures of patients, normally on admission. And then from the 1890s onwards, you do see patient photographs. Mm-hmm. And they like to show a picture of what they were like when they were admitted, and then, if they were recovered, what they looked like at the end. So I was really surprised that there were no pictures of her. I was expecting to see photographs. Mm. And I suspect that if she'd chosen the prison option as opposed to the workhouse option, she would have been photographed, because there'd be a little mugshot of her. But she chose the workhouse option. But it's possible that the Gloucestershire archives, the earlier records, do have the pictures. So it might be worth exploring that a little bit more. Though the picture may be quite distressing, and they generally had a specific uniform. They dressed them in asylum clothing. And I noticed that when she was transferred, they wanted the clothes back. Although she was allowed to travel in the clothes from Gloucestershire to Devon, but Gloucestershire wanted them back, so they had to be sent back.
Jane, as Maude doesn't have a voice, and we've established that there's no photograph as well, you've obviously blogged about her to tell her story. But are there other ways that you're remembering her as equal to the rest of your great-grandparents?
Yes, so On holiday a few years ago, as part of my research, I discovered that what was the former asylum has now been converted into luxury apartments in Devon. And on the one hand, it's a very beautiful building, but to me, it still screams institution, I guess just because of the work I've done.
Yeah.
But we did stop by and visit one day. It was actually on my birthday, which seems perhaps a strange thing to do. But I wanted to see the place and just have a short walk and feel a sense of place. And Maude is buried in the asylum churchyard, which still exists. There are almost no grave markers there. It's just a grassed area with a lich gate. And I guess I now feel that sense of connection because I've been where she went and I've at least seen where she was laid to rest. Perhaps a strange thing to do on one's birthday, but it was important for me to do. So I feel at peace over what I've discovered, even though it's not a happy story.
No. Well, thank you, Jane, for sharing the life story of Lilian Maude Evans. And thank you as well, Kathryn, for helping us to delve deeper into the often murky history of mental health.
You're welcome.
Where can listeners find out more about your work?
I have published 2 books on mental health and researching asylum records. The first one is called Lunatics, Imbeciles and Idiots, A Guide to Insanity in 19th Century Britain, which you mentioned at the beginning. And the second one is called Madness, Murder and Mayhem, and that's about criminal insanity. So those 2 books are available from Pen and Sword Books.
Great. Well, we'll put links to those in this episode's description and the show notes. But for now, Jane, it's time for you to face
the brick wall.
When researching your family history, you'll no doubt hit at least one brick wall, a blocker between you and your ancestors that can last for what feels like, well, forever. But if you don't find one, then are you really looking? In this part of the show, we'll hear about one of my guests' brick walls in a hope that one of you, dear listeners, can help to solve it. Okay, Jane, what have you got for us this time?
Thank you, Andrew. So for my brick wall, I'd like to introduce you to Richard and Mary Hutchinson, who are my 3 times great-grandparents.
Okay.
Now, my 2 times great-grandmother was Harriet Hutchinson. She was born around 1826 in Huddersfield in Yorkshire. Now, I know a good deal about her life, but I know very, very little about her parents, and that's the focus of my brick wall today. So Harriet's marriage certificate, which dates from 1846, shows that she was married in the Roman Catholic Church of St Patrick's in Huddersfield, and that her father was Richard Hutchinson, a silversmith, which is quite an unusual occupation. I don't have any other silversmiths in my tree, but I've been able to locate Richard in the census for 1841, 1851, and 1861.
Okay.
On all 3 of those, the information is pretty consistent. He was born around 1797 or 1798 in Burnley in Lancashire. His occupation was either silversmith or clockmaker, and quite possibly he did both. I think jewellery and clockmaking often went together.
Yeah.
And in the first 2 of those censuses, he was in King Street in Huddersfield, and in the last one, he was in Lower Head Row. I know his wife was called Mary. I've got a possible baptism record for him from 26th of November 1797 at the Church of St Peter in Burnley. This is an Anglican church, so I don't know whether it's the right record because of his daughter marrying in a Catholic church. But it might be that the groom's family insisted on the Catholic ceremony rather than the bride's. I don't know that. I've got no other Catholic ancestors on this part of my family tree at all, so that's really just sort of one unusual fact that's cropped up there.
Yeah.
From the census records, Mary was probably about 5 years older than Richard, and she also came from Lancashire originally. But this is all I know.
Okay.
I have no marriage record for them, so I don't know her maiden name. They may have met and married in Yorkshire, but equally they may have married in Lancashire and then started a family in Yorkshire. So that's really all I know about them. It's probably one of the very last gaps I have at the 3 times great-grandparents level. So it'd be really good to try and find a little bit more about them.
You say you've got Richard and Mary in the 41, 51 and 61 censuses in the 1800s. I would imagine maybe therefore you have got their deaths and you're satisfied with their kind of later life.
No, I'm not. I've lost track of them after 1861, so I don't know if they stayed in Huddersfield or possibly they returned to Lancashire.
Okay.
I'm not very familiar with Lancashire records. I've done a lot on Yorkshire. I've also been to Huddersfield, so it's somewhere that, I feel I know what it was like. I know the ancestors who lived there quite well, but this is sort of one quite stark gap in my knowledge, and that's why I'm using it as my brick wall today.
So you've got a sizable window in on their lives, but you don't know either end.
No.
Oh, okay.
I mean, obviously some later information might actually help with pushing back earlier again. So, in family history, sometimes you have to come forwards a bit in order to go backwards, or you have to go sideways to go backwards. So I'm all ears on this one, and any little nuggets would be very valuable.
Wow. Well, I'm quite excited to crack this one if we can, but we're going to need to turn to the listeners. So what's the best way for listeners to make contact with you if they think that they have a clue or a research idea?
Well, any clue, however small, would be very interesting to hear. So you can contact me through either my website, which is allthosebefore.org.uk, or my main social media platform I use now is Blue Sky, and my handle there is also allthosebefore.
Great. Of course, we'll put those links in the show notes and description, and listeners can head over to familyhistoriespodcast.com where they can read this episode's show notes and send us a message. Or they can just email us at hello@familyhistoriespodcast.com. Now, whilst the listeners go rummaging for answers, it's just possible that I might be able to help you with this one. But you'll need to follow me through to the garage.
Right.
Here we are,
Yes, I know.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
Does it work properly yet?
Does it work? Of course it does. It's a fully functional, highly technical piece of scientific equipment. Do you think I'd have made it this far if it didn't?
Reykjavik.
What?
Reykjavik. You sent me to Reykjavik. I wanted to go to Wales.
Oh, are you sure that's what happened last time?
It was definitely not Wales or the Forest of Dean, and it was definitely not Thomas Edwards.
Ah. Well, sometimes there's the odd blip in the functions, interference from microwaves or solar flares or something. Would you like another trip back in time to see if you can crack this brick wall?
I'm not sure about this, Andrew.
Well, it has had a complete overhaul since last time. Even Charles Babbage came and took a look at it. To be fair, it did take you back in time. I guess the coordinates were just a bit off.
I guess that's true.
Is that a yes?
Okay then.
Excellent. Well, grab a seat, and here's your temporal beacon to get you home again. Remember, it's the
button on the top, I remember.
Of course. So, when and where would you like to go back to this time?
Well, I think my best chance to pin down Richard and Mary would be to slip into St Patrick's Church in Huddersfield on the 18th of November 1846 and hope that they were at their daughter's wedding.
Oh, I love it when people pick weddings. Anyway, there we go. That's all set. Which leaves me with only one thing to say.
What's that?
Jane Hough, thank you, goodbye, and good luck. Ah, back pew, right-hand side. Oh, thank goodness for that. Ooh, a Series 9 guest has just arrived. But just before I go to meet them, we need to talk. There's some really turbulent and difficult things going on in the world at the moment. None of us are invincible. So if you or a loved one need some support, then firstly know that you are not alone. This special episode has been made as part of the Podcast-thon initiative to raise awareness of the work of charities. And with my guest, Jane Hough, we've chosen the mental health charity Mind. Here in the UK, they provide mental health support for those in need, and you can find a support line, resources, or even donate at their website if you want to, at www.mind.org.uk. If you're outside the UK, then check the description of this episode or our website's show notes for a link to a list of useful international support lines and resources to help you through these difficult times. We all need someone to help us through when things get tough, so please don't try to do it alone. Take care, my friend, and I'll be back real soon. The Family Histories podcast was presented and produced by me, Andrew Martin. My guest was the brilliant Jane Hough, and we were joined by the awesome Kathryn Burtinshaw. If you found this episode interesting, then why not share it on your favourite social media channel right now? Go on. Approximately no family historians were harmed in the making of this podcast.